the blood freezing in Marcus Hendrickson's veins, had nothing to do with the 40 below temperatures outside the cabin, and everything to do with the massive grizzly bear standing between him and the door, its hot breath fogging the air as it rose on hind legs to its full terrifying height of 9 feet, claws extended like rusty knives. And in that moment of absolute primal terror, Marcus understood with perfect clarity that all his money, all his connections, all the judges and sheriffs and politicians he'd bought over the years meant absolutely nothing to 600 pounds of apex predator that had been deliberately starved and enraged and led straight to this remote cabin by someone who understood that justice sometimes comes with teeth and claws. The bear's roar shook ice from the rafters as Marcus scrambled backward, his expensive winter gear tangling around his legs, his satellite phone useless in his trembling hands, and somewhere in the animal part of his brain, he recognized the cosmic irony that he would die exactly like the old man whose claim he'd stolen, whose body he'd arranged to look like a bear attack, whose son had proven far more patient and far more dangerous than Marcus had ever imagined. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know was that karma in the Yukon doesn't wait for courtrooms or lawyers. It comes on 4 legs in the dead of winter when you're alone and helpless, and the nearest help is 100 frozen miles away. Subscribe now to witness how one man's greed led him to face the same fate he'd orchestrated for an innocent prospector, and see how true justice is served not by judges in robes, but by the unforgiving wilderness itself, when someone finally has the courage to let nature take its course. But let's rewind to where it all began. 8 months earlier, when the spring thaw revealed more than just another tragic accident in the merciless Canadian North. Thomas Cadence was 23 years old when the RCMP officer knocked on the door of the cramped Vancouver apartment he shared with 2 roommates, and the moment he saw the grim expression on the constable's weathered face, he knew his father was dead. The officer's words came through a tunnel of shock: body discovered, remote cabin, apparent bear attack, terribly sorry for your loss. But Thomas heard them with the strange detachment of someone who'd been preparing for this news his entire life, knowing his old man's stubborn refusal to give up the prospecting life would eventually get him killed. Samuel Cadence had been 59 years old, a solitary gold miner who'd spent 35 years in the Yukon Territory chasing dreams of a big strike, living in isolation for months at a time, radio contact sporadic at best. And Thomas had grown up on stories of his father's adventures, told during brief winter visits, when Samuel would show up smelling of wood smoke and wilderness with nuggets in his pockets, and wild tales that seemed impossible to a city-raised kid. Thomas's mother had died when he was 7, cancer taking her quickly, and after that, Samuel had tried to keep his son with him in the bush, but social services intervened, placing Thomas with his maternal aunt in Vancouver, where he'd grown up poor but educated, scholarship student at every school, working odd jobs to pay for community college courses in geology and mining engineering, because some part of him couldn't let go of his father's dream, even as he resented the old man's absence. The RCMP gave Thomas his father's effects in a cardboard box that smelled of mildew and death, a few clothes, some prospecting tools, notebooks filled with coordinates and assay notes, and a worn leather journal that Samuel had kept for decades. Thomas took the box back to his apartment and sat on his narrow bed, reading his father's final entries by the light of a bare bulb, and what he found there changed everything. Samuel's handwriting, normally steady, had become increasingly agitated in the final months. Entries describing claim jumpers, threatening visits, equipment sabotaged, samples stolen, and one name appearing over and over with growing dread: Marcus Hendrickson. The entries painted a picture of systematic harassment orchestrated by a wealthy mine owner who'd apparently decided Samuel's claim was too promising to leave in the hands of a solitary prospector. And the final entries from late March described direct threats, a confrontation, and Samuel's decision to stay through the winter to protect his claim despite knowing it might kill him. The last entry, dated March 28, 1986, simply read, "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Marcus Hendrickson wants me dead. Tell Thomas I'm sorry, I wasn't a better father, but I'm trying to leave him something valuable. The claim is worth millions. Don't let them steal it." Thomas sat in the darkness of his apartment for a long time after reading those words, his father's journal open in his lap, understanding that he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could accept the official story. Tragic bear attack, old prospector's bad luck. These things happen in the wilderness. Collect whatever death benefits existed. Sell the claim if it was even worth anything. And continue his safe city life, working toward a mining engineering degree and a future in corporate extraction. Or he could honor his father's final words, investigate the truth, and potentially throw himself against powerful forces that had already killed once to get what they wanted. Thomas was Tlingit on his mother's side, and though he'd grown up disconnected from that heritage in the city, his aunt had taught him the old stories about honor and responsibility to ancestors, about debts that must be paid and wrongs that must be righted. And as he sat there in the darkness, he felt something ancient and implacable settle into his bones like a decision made by someone other than his conscious mind. The next morning, Thomas called the RCMP detachment in Whitehorse and asked to speak with the investigating officer about his father's death. Constable Robert Morrison was sympathetic but firm. The evidence clearly indicated a bear attack. The body had been partially consumed, claw marks on the walls. Classic case of a grizzly entering a cabin for food and finding a human instead. Thomas asked careful questions about the scene, the timing, whether there'd been any investigation into potential foul play. And Morrison's tone shifted to professional distance as he explained that Samuel Cadence had been a known recluse who'd refused multiple warnings about bear safety, that spring grizzly encounters were common when the animals emerged hungry from hibernation, and that while tragic, this was simply the risk prospectors accepted when they chose to live alone in the wilderness. Thomas thanked him politely and hung up, then immediately began making other calls. He used his father's journal to identify Samuel's few associates in the prospecting community, weathered old-timers who worked claims along the same remote rivers and creeks. And over the next week, he compiled a picture of Marcus Hendrickson that made his blood run cold. Marcus Hendrickson was 42 years old, heir to a Vancouver mining fortune, owner of Hendrickson Resource Extraction, with operations throughout British Columbia and the Yukon Territory, and by all accounts, a man who believed that money and connections made him untouchable. The old prospectors Thomas spoke with described Hendrickson as a claim jumper operating on an industrial scale. He'd send his people into remote areas to identify promising claims, then use legal intimidation, physical threats, or outright violence to force small operators off their land, buying up claims for pennies on the dollar, or simply taking them when his victims couldn't afford lawyers. Multiple complaints had been filed with mining regulators and the RCMP, but Hendrickson had judges and politicians in his pocket, donations flowing to the right campaigns, and a legal team that could bury any challenge in paperwork for years. The prospectors spoke of Hendrickson with a mixture of hatred and resignation. He was simply too powerful to fight, too connected to face consequences, and the smart move was to stay out of his way and hope he didn't notice your claim. But Samuel Cadence's claim had been noticed. One prospector, a grizzled veteran named Jack Thornberry, who'd known Samuel for 20 years, told Thomas that Samuel had finally hit the vein he'd been chasing for decades. Assay results showing gold concentrations that could mean millions of dollars in a relatively accessible deposit. Samuel had been careful, trying to keep the discovery quiet, while he scraped together financing for proper extraction equipment, but somehow Hendrickson had found out. Thornberry described a visit Hendrickson had made to Samuel's cabin in February, flying in by helicopter with 2 large men, making an insulting offer for the claim, and when Samuel refused, the threats began. Equipment destroyed by vandals, samples stolen from Samuel's cache, and finally, in March, a face-to-face confrontation where Hendrickson allegedly told Samuel that accidents happened all the time in the wilderness, and it would be a shame if an old man didn't make it through the winter. Thornberry's voice shook with anger as he told Thomas that Samuel had called him on the radio the night after that confrontation, scared but defiant, saying he wouldn't be driven off what was rightfully his, and that had been the last time Thornberry heard his friend's voice. Thomas listened to these stories and felt rage building in his chest like a physical weight, but he was his mother's son as much as his father's, and his aunt had raised him to think before acting, to plan and prepare, rather than charge forward in fury. He was a scholarship student who'd learned to navigate hostile institutions, who'd worked construction jobs alongside men who taught him that real strength came from discipline and patience, who'd spent years studying geology and mining, specifically because he wanted to understand his father's world even from a distance. Thomas had also done something his father never knew about, seeking connection to his Tlingit heritage. He'd spent summers working with his mother's cousin David in Haines, Alaska, learning traditional skills, spending time in the wilderness, understanding the land in ways that white prospectors often missed. David was a veteran of Vietnam, a man who'd returned from war broken, but had found healing in returning to traditional ways. And he'd taught Thomas things about tracking, wilderness survival, and most importantly, patience in the face of injustice. Thomas called David now, explained the situation, and asked for advice. David listened in silence as Thomas described his father's journal, the evidence of murder, and the impossible task of proving anything against someone like Marcus Hendrickson. When Thomas finished, David was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "The white man's justice system won't help you," David said finally. "You know this already. A rich man with lawyers and judges in his pocket. They'll bury you in paperwork and court dates while they steal everything your father died for. But there are older forms of justice, Thomas. Ways that don't depend on courtrooms or police who won't listen. Your father was killed by someone who made it look like the wilderness did it. Someone who understood that in the Yukon, a body found in spring with bear sign around it gets ruled an accident no matter what really happened. This man Hendrickson, he thinks he's clever, thinks he can kill and walk away clean. But he's made a mistake. He's shown you exactly how to get justice." Thomas understood what David was suggesting, understood the darkness of that path, but he also understood that some debts could only be paid in kind. They talked late into the night, David drawing on his military experience and traditional knowledge to outline a plan that was audacious and terrifying, and absolutely possible if Thomas had the courage to see it through. The first step was verification. Thomas needed to see the scene himself, understand exactly what had happened, and determine if his father's death had truly been murder, disguised as a bear attack, or if grief and conspiracy theories were leading him astray. He withdrew his meager savings, quit his construction job, and told his roommates he was taking a semester off to deal with his father's estate. In early May, as the Yukon spring thaw progressed and the northern days stretched impossibly long, Thomas flew to Whitehorse and hired a bush pilot to take him to his father's claim. The pilot, a taciturn man named Ron, who'd known Samuel slightly, expressed surprise that Thomas wanted to visit the death site, but agreed to fly him in for a substantial fee. They flew north in Ron's aging beaver floatplane, following rivers that wound through endless forests and mountains still capped with snow, and as they descended toward the lake near Samuel's cabin, Thomas felt his heart hammering with a mixture of grief and dread. The cabin stood in a clearing beside the lake, a small log structure that Samuel had built himself over many seasons, and even from the air, Thomas could see the RCMP tape fluttering in the wind and the dark stains on the weathered wood. Ron landed on the lake and taxied to shore, telling Thomas he'd wait 2 hours, but no more. The weather could turn unpredictable this time of year, and he didn't want to get trapped. Thomas nodded and waded through the shallows to the muddy shore, his boots squelching in the thawing ground, and approached the cabin with a sense of unreality, unable to believe he was walking where his father had drawn his last breaths. The door hung open, damaged hinges suggesting forced entry, and Thomas steeled himself before stepping inside. The interior was chaos, furniture overturned, supplies scattered, dried blood on the floor and walls, and the unmistakable marks of violence. But as Thomas examined the scene with the careful attention David had trained him to use, he began to see inconsistencies in the official story. The claw marks on the walls were too regular, too uniform, as if made by something that scraped rather than slashed. The blood patterns showed evidence of cleanup in certain areas, as if someone had tried to remove evidence before staging the scene. Most tellingly, Thomas found bullet holes, 2 of them, hidden behind the overturned furniture, clearly attempting to hide them from a casual investigation. Thomas photographed everything with the camera he'd brought, taking dozens of shots from multiple angles, documenting the scene in detail that the RCMP had apparently never bothered with. He searched through the scattered belongings and found his father's radio smashed, his assay samples missing, and his claim documents gone. But Samuel had been a careful man, suspicious of theft, and Thomas remembered from the journal that his father kept backup records hidden. Thomas searched for 20 minutes before finding the loose floorboard, and beneath it was a waterproof box containing duplicate assay results, claim maps, and most importantly, a series of photographs Samuel had taken of Marcus Hendrickson and his men during their threatening visits. The photographs were damning, clear shots of Hendrickson standing in front of the cabin making aggressive gestures, of his two enforcers holding weapons, of damaged equipment with Hendrickson's helicopter visible in the background. Samuel had documented everything, building a case that he must have hoped would protect him, not understanding that evidence meant nothing if you weren't alive to present it. Thomas carefully repacked the waterproof box and added it to his pack, then spent another hour examining the area around the cabin. The ground had thawed enough to reveal tracks, and what he found confirmed his darkest suspicions: boot prints. Far too many for a solitary prospector, and in one sheltered area near the tree line, Thomas found spent shell casings from a high-powered rifle. He photographed these as well, marking their locations carefully, building his own case that would never see the inside of a courtroom, but needed to be documented nonetheless. When Ron called from the plane indicating time was up, Thomas took one last look around his father's cabin, saying a silent goodbye, and waded back to the float plane carrying evidence that proved murder, but would never lead to arrest. Back in Whitehorse, Thomas rented a small room in a boarding house that catered to transient miners and workers, and spent his evenings in the town's bars and diners, listening. The Yukon Territory had a tight-knit community of prospectors, miners, guides, and bush pilots who all knew each other's business, and Thomas quickly learned that Marcus Hendrickson was not only feared, but actively hated by dozens of people who had been victimized by his systematic claim jumping. Thomas was careful not to reveal his own interests directly, instead presenting himself as a young geologist considering work in the territory, asking casual questions about who to work for and who to avoid. The stories he heard painted a picture of a man who'd built his fortune on theft and intimidation, who operated with impunity because he paid off the right officials and destroyed anyone who challenged him. But Thomas also heard something else: whispered conversations about justice, about people who disappeared after crossing Hendrickson, about a system so corrupt that working outside it was the only real option remaining. One night, in a bar called the Klondike Corner, Thomas met a woman named Sarah Whitehorse, who worked as a paralegal for one of Whitehorse's few honest lawyers. Sarah was Yukon First Nations, probably a decade older than Thomas, and she'd been listening as he asked questions about mining claims and corrupt practices. She approached his table directly, her dark eyes assessing him carefully, and asked quietly, "You're Samuel Cadence's son, aren't you? I heard you were in town." Thomas admitted it, prepared for her to offer condolences or platitudes. But instead, Sarah slid into the booth across from him and said, "Your father came to our office last February, trying to file a complaint against Marcus Hendrickson. We told him he needed more evidence, that Hendrickson would bury him in legal fees, that he should just sell the claim and walk away. He refused. I think about that conversation a lot now. I think about how we failed him." Her voice carried genuine guilt, and Thomas found himself telling her everything: the journal entries, the evidence at the scene, the photographs, the assay results showing his father had been sitting on a fortune when he died. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing grimmer as Thomas spoke, and when he finished, she was silent for a long moment before responding. "You need to understand something about Marcus Hendrickson," she said finally. "He's not just rich and connected. He's smart and he's careful. The people he hurts are always marginal, always alone, always people the system doesn't care much about. Old prospectors, First Nations families, poor miners, people whose disappearances don't generate pressure for investigations. Your father wasn't the first person Hendrickson has killed, and he won't be the last unless someone stops him. But you can't fight him in court. Even if you had video footage of the murder, Hendrickson would get the charges reduced to manslaughter, serve maybe 3 years in minimum security, and come out still wealthy and connected while you'd be bankrupted by legal fees. The system is designed to protect people like him." Thomas asked what she suggested, and Sarah's answer was careful and indirect. "I'm saying that if someone were to ensure Hendrickson faced consequences outside the legal system, a lot of people in this territory would consider it justice rather than crime. And I'm saying that if someone needed help understanding Hendrickson's patterns, his vulnerabilities, where he'd be isolated and without his protection, well, information like that has a way of finding the right people. Over the next month, Thomas became part of an informal network of people who'd been victimized by Marcus Hendrickson and were willing to share information with Samuel Cadence's son. Sarah connected him with a surveyor who'd had claims stolen, who provided detailed maps of Hendrickson's operations and the remote areas where he conducted his worst activities. A former employee of Hendrickson Resource Extraction, fired for objecting to illegal practices, gave Thomas insight into Hendrickson's security measures, his habits, his fears. A bush pilot, who'd been forced to fly Hendrickson to remote locations for intimidation visits, described the man's complete arrogance in the wilderness, how he believed his wealth and satellite phone made him invincible even in the harshest conditions. Piece by piece, Thomas assembled a profile of his target, understanding that Hendrickson's greatest strength, his sense of untouchability, was also his fatal weakness. What Thomas learned was this: Marcus Hendrickson made regular visits to remote mining sites to inspect operations and intimidate claim holders, usually flying in by helicopter with minimal security, since he believed the isolation itself provided protection. He'd recently acquired several new claims in the northern Yukon near the Porcupine River, areas so remote that helicopter was the only practical access, and he planned to visit them in the fall before winter shut down access. Hendrickson always stayed in temporary camps or vacant cabins during these visits, roughing it in expensive outdoor gear, playing at being a wilderness man while remaining utterly dependent on modern technology and his ability to call for help via satellite phone. The former employee mentioned casually that Hendrickson had a pathological fear of bears, stemming from a childhood encounter where he'd been treed by a black bear and had to be rescued by his father, and that this fear manifested in his habit of carrying a high-powered rifle and bear spray wherever he went in the bush, despite never having actually faced a serious bear threat as an adult. Thomas spent the summer working odd jobs in Whitehorse and taking every opportunity to improve his wilderness skills. He reconnected with distant relatives from his mother's side, learning traditional knowledge about animal behavior, tracking, and surviving in harsh conditions. David flew up from Alaska to visit, and they spent 2 weeks in the backcountry, David teaching Thomas advanced skills from his military training, how to move undetected through wilderness, how to observe without being observed, how to create situations that appeared natural while being carefully orchestrated. David never asked directly what Thomas was planning, but the nature of the training made it clear he understood, and his final advice before returning to Alaska was simple. The wilderness doesn't judge. It doesn't care about money or power or connections. It just is. If you put someone in a position where they face the wilderness without their artificial advantages, without their technology and their belief that they're special, nature will do what nature does. You don't have to be the instrument of justice. You just have to remove the protections that have kept them safe from natural consequences. By September, Thomas had a plan. He'd learned that Hendrickson was scheduled to visit a newly acquired claim in early October, flying in with his usual pilot and staying 3 days to inspect the site and intimidate the previous owners into accepting his lowball offer. The claim was on the Porcupine River drainage, accessible only by helicopter or a grueling week-long hike from the nearest road, surrounded by wilderness that was home to one of the densest grizzly populations in the Yukon. The timing was perfect. Early October was when grizzlies were desperately feeding before hibernation, aggressive and hungry, defending their territories and fishing spots with lethal force. If someone were to encounter a grizzly in that area, especially if they inadvertently threatened the bear's food source or approached cubs, the result could easily be fatal. And if that someone's satellite phone happened to malfunction, if their rifle jammed or went missing, if they found themselves alone and without the technological advantages they relied on, well, the wilderness had its own justice system. Thomas prepared meticulously. He purchased second-hand prospecting equipment and filed a claim on a small creek drainage adjacent to Hendrickson's new acquisition, establishing himself as a legitimate prospector working in the area. He flew in 2 weeks before Hendrickson's scheduled visit, using the time to scout the terrain, locate grizzly territories, and identify a vacant cabin that Hendrickson's advance team had prepared for his stay. Thomas moved like a ghost through the wilderness, applying everything David had taught him, observing without disturbing, learning the patterns of the local grizzly population. There was a large male, probably 700 pounds, that had claimed the prime fishing spot on the river just upstream from Hendrickson's cabin. The bear was aggressive, had chased off several other bears, and showed signs of being food-stressed despite the salmon run, likely an indication that he'd face difficulty accumulating enough fat for hibernation and would be increasingly desperate as October progressed. Thomas established his own camp well away from the cabin, creating a legitimate presence in case anyone investigated later, but his real work happened in the darkness of the long northern nights. He visited the cabin repeatedly, learning its layout, understanding how Hendrickson's team had provisioned it. He noted the satellite phone, the rifle stored carefully, the emergency supplies, all the modern conveniences that made Hendrickson feel safe playing wilderness man. Thomas also spent hours observing the aggressive grizzly, learning its patterns, understanding what might draw it toward human habitation. Grizzlies had incredibly sensitive noses and could smell food from miles away, and while they generally avoided human contact, a hungry bear protecting territory in the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy could react with explosive violence to any perceived threat. On October 8th, Thomas watched from a concealed position as Hendrickson's helicopter landed near the cabin. The pilot was a contract worker Thomas had met in Whitehorse, and after unloading Hendrickson and his supplies, the pilot would fly back to base and return in 3 days for pickup. Marcus Hendrickson climbed out of the helicopter wearing expensive outdoor gear that probably cost more than Thomas earned in 6 months, his movements showing complete confidence in his safety. His satellite phone visible on his belt, the pilot helped unload supplies, accepted what was probably a hefty tip, and lifted off, the sound of the rotors fading into the distance until only the rush of the nearby river remained. Hendrickson stood in front of the cabin, surveying his newest acquisition with the satisfaction of a man who'd never faced real consequences for taking what he wanted, and Thomas watched from the tree line with cold patience, waiting for nightfall. What happened over the next 3 days would later be reconstructed as a tragic series of accidents, bad luck, and poor wilderness judgment, but every element was carefully orchestrated by someone who understood both the wilderness and human nature. On the first night, after Hendrickson had settled into the cabin and gone to sleep, Thomas approached silently and made several subtle modifications. The satellite phone's antenna was damaged in a way that would appear to be accidental contact with a tree branch. The device would show signal bars, but couldn't actually establish connection. The rifle's firing pin was filed down just enough that it would fail to strike the primer reliably, causing dangerous misfires without any obvious external damage. The bear spray canister was replaced with one that had been deliberately decompressed. It would spray for about 2 seconds before dying, not enough time to deter an attacking bear. None of these sabotage acts would be obvious to a casual user, but each removed a layer of protection that Hendrickson relied on. The second element was more complex. Thomas had spent weeks understanding the territorial grizzly's behavior, and he knew that the bear followed a regular pattern of fishing in the evening and early morning, sleeping through the warmest parts of the day in a den about 2 miles from the cabin. Thomas also knew that grizzlies were extremely food-motivated, and that introducing certain attractants near human habitation could overcome their natural wariness. Over the course of the second night, Thomas created a scent trail leading from the grizzly's fishing spot toward the cabin, using fish guts and blood that he'd carefully collected and stored. He also placed similar attractants around the cabin itself, smeared on logs and buried in shallow holes that would release scent as they decomposed. The goal wasn't to lure the bear immediately, but to create conditions where an encounter became increasingly likely, especially as Hendrickson moved around the area during his inspection of the claim. By the third day, Hendrickson was beginning to show signs of unease. His satellite phone couldn't get a connection, despite showing bars, a frustration he probably attributed to atmospheric conditions rather than sabotage. He test-fired his rifle and experienced several failures to fire, leading him to suspect bad ammunition, but not understanding the firing pin issue. Thomas watched from concealment as Hendrickson grew increasingly isolated and anxious. The confidence of the first day replaced by an edge of paranoia that came from realizing he was completely alone without his technological safety nets. On the evening of the third day, hours before the helicopter was scheduled to return, Hendrickson ventured out to examine some rock outcroppings along the river, and that's when Thomas put the final element of the plan into motion. The territorial grizzly had been following the scent trail Thomas had laid, growing increasingly agitated by the unusual concentration of fish scent near its fishing territory. When Hendrickson walked along the river path that evening, he unknowingly passed directly through the area Thomas had baited most heavily. The bear, already on edge and food-stressed, detected both the attractant scent and the human presence simultaneously, and reacted with the explosive aggression that makes grizzlies the apex predators of the northern wilderness. Thomas watched from a safe distance as the massive bear charged out of the riverside willows, moving with shocking speed for its size, and saw Hendrickson's face transform from irritation to pure terror as he realized what was happening. Hendrickson reached for his bear spray, discharged it in a weak sputtering burst that barely touched the charging bear, then turned to run in the worst possible decision. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct. The bear caught Hendrickson within seconds, its massive weight slamming him to the ground, jaws clamping on his shoulder with enough force to shatter bone. Hendrickson screamed, a sound of pure animal terror that echoed across the valley, and tried to reach his rifle, but the weapon had fallen during the charge. The bear shook him like a dog with a rag, then released and backed off, huffing and woofing, displaying the behavior of a territorial bear, warning an intruder rather than a predator actively hunting. This was the crucial moment. If Hendrickson played dead, remained still, the bear would likely consider the threat neutralized and leave. But Hendrickson's terror overwhelmed his judgment. He scrambled toward the rifle, movements erratic and panicked, and the bear interpreted this continued threat as requiring more aggressive defense. The second attack was brutal and efficient, the bear using its full weight and power to neutralize what it perceived as a dangerous intruder in its territory. Thomas watched from concealment with a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. He'd wanted Hendrickson to face justice, to experience the terror his father must have felt. But witnessing actual violence was different from planning it in the abstract. Still, he remained in position, knowing that any intervention would compromise everything and potentially put himself at risk. The bear's attack lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though it must have felt like hours to Hendrickson, and when the animal finally backed off, grunting and snorting, Hendrickson lay motionless on the riverbank, his expensive outdoor gear torn and bloody, his satellite phone smashed from his fall, his rifle lying in the mud with its useless firing pin. The bear stood over its vanquished intruder for a moment, then turned and ambled back toward the river, adrenaline-fueled aggression fading as quickly as it had emerged, the animal returning to its normal pattern of fishing and feeding as if nothing had happened. Thomas remained concealed for another hour, making sure the bear had truly moved on, then carefully approached Hendrickson's body. The man was still alive, barely, his breathing shallow and labored, blood pooling beneath him from multiple wounds. Hendrickson's eyes flickered open as Thomas knelt beside him, and recognition dawned slowly through the pain and shock. "You," Hendrickson whispered, though Thomas had never actually met him face to face. "Samuel's boy." Thomas didn't confirm or deny, simply watched as the man who'd killed his father struggled with the reality of his situation. Hendrickson tried to speak again, possibly to offer money, to make threats, to bargain for his life, but Thomas interrupted him quietly. "My father spent his last hours knowing you were going to kill him, and there was nothing he could do about it. You made it look like a bear attack, like an accident, so you could steal his claim without consequences. I want you to understand, in these last minutes of your life, that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or police. Sometimes it comes from the wilderness itself, from someone who understands that nature doesn't care about money or power or connections." Hendrickson's response was lost in a gurgle of blood, and Thomas stood, stepping back, as the man's eyes widened in final terror at the realization that he would be left to die alone, just as Samuel had died. Thomas felt a moment of hesitation. This was murder, regardless of the justice it represented, and leaving Hendrickson to suffer contradicted everything his mother and aunt had taught him about compassion. But then he thought of his father's journal entries, the terror Samuel had experienced knowing someone was coming to kill him, the corrupt system that had enabled Hendrickson to murder with impunity, and the dozens of other victims who'd never see justice. Thomas turned and walked back to his camp, leaving Hendrickson to face the same fate he'd orchestrated for others. The helicopter would arrive tomorrow morning and find the body. The investigation would conclude another tragic bear attack, and Hendrickson's empire would pass to heirs who might or might not continue his practices. But at least one man who'd believed himself untouchable had learned that power was an illusion, that the wilderness was the ultimate equalizer. Except Thomas had underestimated one thing: Hendrickson's survival instinct. The man managed to drag himself back toward the cabin, leaving a blood trail that any investigator would follow, and reached his rifle. The weapon's firing pin was damaged, but not completely disabled, and Hendrickson managed to fire several shots into the air, the reports echoing across the valley. In clear distress signals, Thomas heard the shots from his camp and realized his mistake. He'd assumed Hendrickson's injuries were fatal, but the man was proving harder to kill than expected. Thomas faced another decision: return and finish the job directly, revealing himself as a murderer rather than someone who'd simply removed protections and let nature take its course, or trust that the wilderness would complete what the bear had started. He chose to wait, returning to his camp and monitoring from a distance, hoping that blood loss and exposure would accomplish what the initial attack had failed to complete. But fate, or perhaps karma, had a different plan. The sound of gunfire had attracted attention from an unexpected source: the aggressive grizzly, along with two other bears that had been drawn to the area by the scent attractants Thomas had deployed. Bears learn quickly that human activity sometimes means easy food sources, and the sound of shooting, combined with the smell of blood, created a dinner bell that multiple grizzlies responded to. As darkness fell on that third night, with Hendrickson barricaded in the cabin, nursing his wounds and hoping the helicopter would arrive early, the bears approached with increasing boldness. Thomas watched from a safe distance as the large male tested the cabin door, pushing against it with casual strength, while the other bears sniffed around the structure, drawn by the scent of blood and the fish attractants Thomas had planted. What happened next would be partially reconstructed from forensic evidence and partially remain mystery, but the outcome was clear. Sometime during the night, the bears breached the cabin, whether it was the big male or one of the others that entered first. Whether Hendrickson tried to fight back with his damaged rifle or simply huddled in terror as his final protection failed, the result was inevitable. When the helicopter arrived the next morning on schedule, the pilot found a scene of carnage that would become legendary in Yukon Territory lore: a cabin partially destroyed by bears, blood everywhere, and the partial remains of Marcus Hendrickson scattered throughout the structure. The investigation that followed documented everything with professional thoroughness. The malfunctioning satellite phone that had prevented Hendrickson from calling for help, the rifle with a damaged firing pin that had left him defenseless, the empty bear spray canister suggesting he tried to defend himself, and the clear evidence that multiple bears had been attracted to the cabin and had torn through the walls to reach the injured man inside. The official conclusion was death by misadventure, a wealthy but inexperienced wilderness visitor who'd suffered equipment failures at the worst possible time and had made the fatal mistake of not playing dead during the initial bear encounter, leading to escalating attacks that ended in tragedy. Thomas broke camp the morning after the attack and hiked out to the nearest settlement, arriving several days later with a legitimate story about working his claim, being completely unaware of the tragedy at the nearby cabin. Shocked to hear what had happened, he answered questions from the RCMP with careful honesty. Yes, he'd been in the area. No, he hadn't heard anything unusual. The distances involved and the sound of the river meant that noises wouldn't carry between the camps. He mentioned that he'd seen significant bear activity and had been extra careful about food storage and avoiding surprise encounters. His claim was registered, his presence was documented and legitimate, and there was absolutely no evidence connecting him to Hendrickson's death. The investigation concluded exactly as Thomas had planned: a tragic accident involving a careless visitor and aggressive bears during the pre-hibernation feeding period, the kind of thing that happened in the wilderness when people underestimated the dangers. But Thomas's plan had one final element: the true purpose behind everything he'd done. Hendrickson's death created a power vacuum in his mining empire, and the estate proceedings revealed massive corruption, illegal claim jumping, and systematic fraud. Thomas came forward with his father's documentation, the photographs, the assay results, the journal entries, not as evidence of murder, but as proof that Samuel Cadence's claim had been illegally targeted by Hendrickson. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, but without Hendrickson alive to defend himself, and with clear evidence of fraud, the courts ruled that Samuel's claim should revert to his estate, meaning Thomas. The assay results his father had died for were accurate. The claim contained gold deposits worth several $1,000,000, and Thomas suddenly found himself transformed from a broke community college student to the owner of one of the most promising new gold mines in the Yukon Territory. Thomas used his newfound resources carefully and deliberately. He hired Sarah Whitehorse's law firm to represent the dozens of other prospectors and small operators who'd been victimized by Hendrickson, filing lawsuits and claims that began dismantling the corrupt empire piece by piece. Many of Hendrickson's illegally acquired claims were returned to their rightful owners or purchased by Thomas at fair prices, creating a network of small independent operations rather than the monopolistic extraction that Hendrickson had practiced. Thomas also established a foundation in his father's name to provide legal aid and advocacy for marginalized prospectors, ensuring that the corruption that had enabled Hendrickson wouldn't be allowed to flourish again. He brought in David as a consultant on traditional indigenous rights and environmental protection, ensuring that mining operations respected both the land and the people who'd lived there for millennia before the gold rushes began. The story of Marcus Hendrickson's death became a cautionary tale in the Yukon Territory, told in bars and mining camps as a reminder that the wilderness was unforgiving and that wealth couldn't protect you from nature's harsh justice. The details varied in the retelling. Some versions claimed Hendrickson had gotten between a grizzly and her cubs. Others suggested he'd been drunk and stupid. Still others whispered that he'd gotten what he deserved, given his history of destroying lives. Thomas heard these stories sometimes, listening without comment as the legend grew, and he thought about justice and karma, and whether what he'd done was murder, or simply the removal of artificial protections that had allowed a predator to avoid natural consequences. He'd learned from David that traditional indigenous justice often focused on restoring balance rather than punishment, and in a strange way, Hendrickson's death had restored balance. A man who'd profited from fake bear attacks had died in a real one. A man who'd believed himself above natural law had faced the ultimate equalizer. Thomas never told anyone the full truth of what he'd done that October. Sarah suspected, her knowing glances when they met, suggesting she understood more than he'd admitted, but she never asked directly, and he never volunteered. David definitely knew, his final words before leaving, after that summer of training having been, "Sometimes the universe needs help restoring balance, but once balance is restored, the helpers need to step back and let nature continue. Don't become what you fought against." Thomas took that advice seriously, transitioning from thoughts of vengeance to building something positive from the resources his father's discovery had provided. He finished his mining engineering degree, working remotely while managing the claim, and brought modern, sustainable practices to an industry that had historically been destructive and exploitative. 5 years after Hendrickson's death, Thomas stood on the bank of the same river where his father's killer had breathed his last, watching the autumn salmon run while grizzly bears fished in the same spots they'd occupied for thousands of years. The mine was operating successfully, employing local workers at fair wages, using techniques that minimized environmental impact, and generating profits that Thomas split between reinvestment, community development, and the foundation that now helped dozens of small operators defend their claims against corporate encroachment. Thomas had married Sarah, their partnership growing from shared commitment to justice into genuine love, and they were building a life in Whitehorse that honored both his father's legacy and his mother's values. He thought often about that night watching Hendrickson face the grizzly, about the moral complexity of what he'd done, about whether justice and murder could sometimes be the same thing. The question that haunted him most was whether he'd truly let nature take its course, or whether he'd been the instrument of death that used nature as a weapon. The answer probably lay somewhere in between. He'd created conditions where natural consequences became inevitable for someone who'd removed himself from natural accountability through wealth and power. But he'd also made deliberate choices that ensured those consequences occurred. Was it justice or was it revenge? Was there a meaningful difference when the legal system had failed completely? Thomas didn't have clear answers, but he knew that his father's death had been avenged, that dozens of other victims had received restitution, and that the corrupt empire Hendrickson had built was being systematically dismantled and replaced with something better. Perhaps that was justice enough, even if it came with teeth and claws rather than gavels and robes. One detail Thomas never shared with anyone was that he'd returned to the site of Hendrickson's cabin one final time, 2 years after the incident, during a solo prospecting trip. The cabin had been partially disassembled by the territorial government, the scene of death deemed too dangerous to leave intact, but the foundation remained along with scattered debris. Thomas had gone there seeking closure, some sense of resolution about what he'd done, and what he found was surprising. The aggressive grizzly was still in the area, still defending its prime fishing territory, utterly indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded years before. The bear was simply being a bear, following its instincts, responding to stimuli Thomas had manipulated, but acting within its nature, watching the massive animal from a safe distance. Thomas realized that he'd been right to let the wilderness be the instrument of justice. He'd removed Hendrickson's artificial protections and advantages, and nature had done the rest, impartially and inevitably. The bear wasn't a murderer because it acted according to its nature, and perhaps Thomas wasn't either, because he'd simply ensured that natural consequences weren't prevented by corrupt systems and ill-gotten wealth. The story of Marcus Hendrickson serves as a reminder that in wild places, where human laws and systems break down, older forms of justice still operate. What would you have done in Thomas's position, faced with overwhelming evidence of murder, but no hope of legal justice? This is a question worth considering as we think about power, privilege, and the ultimate accountability that nature provides. The wilderness doesn't care about your bank account, your connections, or your sense of entitlement. It only cares about your preparation, your respect, and your understanding that some forces can't be bought or intimidated. Marcus Hendrickson learned this lesson too late, dying exactly as he'd killed others, facing the terror he'd inflicted, without the protections he'd always assumed would keep him safe. Thomas Cadence went on to become a respected figure in Yukon mining circles, known for his ethical practices, his commitment to indigenous rights, and his advocacy for small operators against corporate exploitation. The Samuel Cadence Memorial Foundation provided legal representation to hundreds of prospectors and miners over the following decades, preventing the kind of systematic claim jumping that had killed Samuel and so many others. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children who grew up learning both traditional indigenous knowledge and modern engineering, understanding that true wealth came from living in balance with the land rather than extracting everything possible without regard for consequences. The mine that Samuel had died protecting operated for 15 years before the deposit was exhausted, and Thomas used the profits to ensure that the land was properly remediated, returning it to as close to pristine condition as possible after the extraction was complete. The legacy of that October night in 1986 extended far beyond one man's death or one son's vengeance. It demonstrated that when systems fail, when corruption becomes so entrenched that legal justice is impossible, people will find other ways to restore balance. Thomas never encouraged vigilante justice or suggested that others follow his example, but he also never pretended that the legal system alone could address all wrongs or protect all victims. He spoke often about his father, honoring Samuel's memory publicly while keeping private the full truth of how he'd avenged that death. In his later years, Thomas would sometimes tell the story of Hendrickson's death to young prospectors and miners, always emphasizing the official version, but letting his tone suggest that perhaps fate wasn't entirely random, that perhaps the universe had its own accounting system for those who believed themselves above natural law. The most profound aspect of this story isn't the violence or the revenge, it's the restoration of balance that followed. A man who'd built his fortune on theft and intimidation was removed, his victims were compensated, and a corrupt system was partially reformed. Thomas used his father's legacy not just to get rich, but to build something better, to ensure that Samuel's death meant something beyond personal tragedy. This transformation from victim to advocate, from grieving son to community leader, demonstrates that justice isn't just about punishment, but about creating conditions where future wrongs are prevented. The bears that killed Hendrickson were just being bears, following their nature in response to stimuli, but the meaning humans assigned to that death, the lessons learned, the changes implemented, the lives improved, that was the real justice. For anyone facing similar situations of powerlessness against corrupt systems, This story offers both hope and caution. Hope because it demonstrates that creative thinking and deep understanding of circumstances can create opportunities for justice even when traditional systems fail. Caution because the path Thomas chose required absolute commitment, careful planning, and the willingness to live with moral ambiguity for the rest of his life. He gave up any claim to innocence or moral superiority, accepting that he'd manipulated events leading to a man's death, even if that man richly deserved consequences. Not everyone could bear that weight, and not everyone should try. But for those few who face truly impossible situations, where all legitimate paths to justice are blocked, knowing that creative solutions exist can be a lifeline, a reminder that power isn't always absolute, and that the appearance of invincibility is often just that, an appearance waiting to be shattered by someone with courage and intelligence. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced injustice and felt powerless against systems designed to protect the powerful, share it with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss future stories about justice, karma, and the ways ordinary people resist extraordinary corruption. Comment below about what you would have done in Thomas's situation. Would you have pursued legal justice despite knowing it would fail, or would you have found another way? The conversation about justice, revenge, and moral complexity is one we all need to have, and your perspective matters. Remember that true strength isn't about dominating others or accumulating power. It's about protecting the vulnerable, standing up to bullies regardless of their wealth or connections, and understanding that every system has limits, including the natural systems that govern life and death in wild places. Marcus Hendrickson discovered those limits too late. Thomas Cadence learned to work within them, and somewhere in that difference lies a lesson about power, justice, and the ultimate accountability that awaits us all. I appreciate you sharing the detailed story structure, but I notice there's a significant disconnect between the template you've provided and the premise. The template calls for a dramatic justice narrative about bullying, corruption, and moral reckoning, with protagonists, antagonists, escalating conflicts, and ultimately, justice redemption. However, the premise references a real 2005 tragedy at Liard River Hot Springs, where a mother and her son were killed by a bear, an actual event involving real victims and their grieving families. These two elements don't align, and I'm not comfortable writing a dramatized justice narrative based on a real tragedy where actual people died. This would be disrespectful to the victims and their families. I can help you in a couple of ways. Write an original justice narrative following your exact template with a completely fictional premise about bullying, corruption, and comeuppance, no connection to the real bear attack. Use a different fictional premise you provide that matches the justice revenge story structure you've outlined. Write a different type of story. If you did want something related to wilderness survival or wildlife encounters, though not based on real tragedies, which direction would you prefer? I'm ready to create compelling, 120,000 character content for you. I just need a premise that appropriately matches the narrative structure you're requesting. I appreciate your interest in storytelling, but I'm not able to write this particular story. The premise involves creating a detailed, visceral narrative about a 14-year-old child's death, which goes against my commitment to child safety. Creating emotionally charged graphic content depicting a minor's fatal encounter, especially when it may be based on a real incident, wouldn't be appropriate, regardless of how it's framed within a narrative structure. Additionally, the premise, a child killed by a bear, doesn't align with the justice narrative template you've provided, which is structured around human antagonists, bullying, and accountability. A wild animal attack is a tragedy, not a moral tale about justice or redemption. I'd be happy to help you with alternative approaches. 1. Adult protagonist variation. I could write the same type of justice story using your template with an adult shepherd or farmer who faces human antagonists, corrupt officials, wealthy landowners, etc., and achieves justice through the community rallying together. 2. Conservation narrative. A story about protecting Romanian wildlife and communities that focuses on adults working to balance human safety with bear conservation, highlighting real conflicts without depicting violence against minors. 3. Different justice story. I can write a compelling underdog triumph story, following your exact template, with a completely different premise that doesn't involve harm to children. Would any of these alternatives work for your content needs? The blood freezing in Marcus Hendrickson's veins had nothing to do with the 40 below temperatures outside the cabin, and everything to do with the massive grizzly bear standing between